And here we are for episode, do you
24, I
know the
think this
number?
time. Yeah.
24? I think you're right. Yep,
Yep. hmm
great.
All right.
It's been about four
Yes.
weeks.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. 4 weeks. What's been up?
Well, been prepping for, I've got a couple of trips coming up. There's a couple of things I'm going to mention. I'm speaking at the men's conference in New Zealand, and also I'm going to have a go at pronouncing the name of the town in a minute too. But and I'm also speaking at ICMI 23, which is in, I think it's pronounced Pune in India. It's near Mumbai.
Okay. Now remind me,
So
when is that again?
so that's ICMI 23 in.
Hmm?
Yeah, so most of us are flying into Mumbai. I'm going to spend a couple of days there and then head
Yeah.
over to Pune for the conference.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
then,
When was that again? I'm sorry.
oh, sorry, Pune. It's a little town near Mumbai.
No. No. When? When?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. It is the 30th of September to the 2nd of October.
All right. Hmm.
And the conference in New Zealand, the Men's Summit, I really love what they did there, MENZ, the Men's Summit, is the 9th of September. So looming quite close now. I'm just bringing up the name of the town, and let's see if I can pronounce it correctly. It's Ohope. I think it's maybe pronounced Hope. I think.
Okay. Hmm.
Yes. Anyway, it's a little town on the east coast of New Zealand, on the North Island of New Zealand.
Okay. All right. So we
So
have.
my
Yeah.
talks are organised, but maybe I don't disclose too much about them.
Okay. All right. So
But
what do we got?
yeah, I was going to say if anyone's in New Zealand and they're looking at going to the conference, that'd be fantastic to meet up. I'm yeah. So if you look on ICI, if you look on sorry Wiki for Men, you will see a page there on the men's summits, which have all the information, and also too, Wiki for Men has information on ICMI 23. If anyone's, I know a few people are going over to India, so be fabulous to meet up with anyone there, especially people I haven't met before. There's a whole bunch of obviously a lot. Most of the people going to the conference are obviously Indian. There's quite a number of people I've known online for a number of years who I'll be meeting there too. So that'll be fabulous. The next item I wanted to mention is Gillette. We were going to talk about this, I think, 2 weeks ago,
Hmm.
and unfortunately, the meeting we couldn't. The recording got cancelled. So I just happened to, actually going back about 3 weeks now, I just happened to go look at, I don't even what it reminded me. Everyone, of course, will remember the Gillette woke ad. What is it? All a man can be, I think,
Yeah.
in January 2019. And of course, a lot of people predicted get woke, go broke. And I just happened to be looking at their share price recently, and a few weeks ago, as I said, and it does appear that in the months afterwards, there were some initial reports of this, and there were some media reports of them having a write down and all sorts of things. But what's really interesting is their share price slid in 2019, around about mid 2019. So it wasn't immediately after the ad, it was a couple of months later. It hasn't recovered. That's what I find most interesting about this.
All right. So I'm seeing the chart right now, and
Yes. And we can put a link up to that.
yeah, sure. And you said so. I myself kind of had a hard time remembering what year this actually was. It seems so. I don't know if it was so long ago or so recent. So
There's so much
it's
happening, but it was actually, I checked, it was January 2019
mhm.
when that happened, especially with the
Okay.
pandemic, I guess, too. 2020 and 2021, had a lot packed into them. But yeah, it was actually January 2019. And if you look, which we can provide a link to this. This is a screenshot I took about 3 weeks ago. The share price was stable for a little while, and then actually briefly went up, and then started to slide, and it's never recovered from that slide.
Okay. Yeah, I see the slide right there, but
Yeah.
it's weird. It looks like it's met its peak and then started to slide.
Well, the one I've got goes back to 2018. It was a
Yeah.
there was a it is a bit higher in 2019 than 2018, But if
Yeah.
if you look, it's from 2019 onwards, it's even lower than that original 2018 value.
Right. Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
just observing that it's funny
yeah,
that it had its highest moment in that time span and then plummet all of a sudden.
yeah. I suspect I'm not terribly surprised that there was a delay. Gillette, by the way, tried to claim that there was, I think, an $8 billion write down was mentioned at the time, a few months later, but they tried to claim it wasn't related, just a coincidental timing. But I wouldn't be terribly surprised if there is something of a delay because I think it does take time for these messages to filter through to the wider community and also to reporting. I think there could be potentially delays in that sort of thing. So I'm not terribly surprised we see a slide a few months later, and I can't prove it, but I think the timing is really interesting and the fact it stayed down more than anything. I think.
Sure. That makes sense.
So I suppose we can check on Bud Light in a couple of years and see what their share price is like.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds like fun.
Do you have anything particularly you want to talk about tonight, Vernon?
Well, there's something I've been mulling over. So I don't know if a lot of you know, but so I'm going to do a bit of a friendly plug for some friends in our men's movement.
Yep.
So um, so Elizabeth Hobson and Philip Tanzer, I'm pretty sure a lot of you know who those two are. They've got their own MR radio going on. They had an MR radio before, but this is kind of like a new version of that podcast, and it's just the two of them. And so
Yep.
they've been doing that every Wednesday, I think.
Okay.
I think they're in their 10th or so episode. So this is a bit of a plug right there for them. They've been doing it for a short while, but their latest episode didn't really have an agenda of stuff to speak about, but they talked about in general, this is quoting Philip in his Twitter post. Is our society F00KED?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
right. Yeah,
Right.
so yeah, sure. So instead of responding straight to that, I've been giving it some thoughts
Yeah.
over the few days, and
Hmm.
well, before I give mine, what is your immediate response to that? Is our society fucked?
I think it's a great question, and it is one that I've mulled over myself. There's a lot of people I know, friends and acquaintances, and the broader men's rights community and so forth, who would absolutely categorically say our society is fucked. So there are some people I know, and that you know, Vernon, who are I wouldn't say looking forward to it, but they're saying that when it happens, there will be a recognition of the importance of men in society and in rebuilding. My response to that is usually something along the lines of, yeah, but we have to go through the collapse of the society, which will be a roundly unpleasant process, irrespective of whether you happen to be a man or not. So, even if yes, there's more misandry declines afterwards and so forth. So I haven't got your question yet, but even if misandry declines and so forth, there's a lot of pain in the foreground. And before I answer your question, my aim since getting involved with men's rights 10 years ago has been to try to avert that because I think that it's certainly on the cards. Okay. And my aim has been to avert that. So basically, I've had two aims. One, to try to avert that, or two, if I can't, document it. Okay.
That makes sense.
And so
Yeah.
if you look at some of that Wiki for Men, there's a lot of recording going on there of groups and events and so forth. And that's part of that is recording it. Gosh. Okay. Now to get to your question, I can't obviously see the future. I think probably not on balance, but I think it might be kind of 55-45. I'm only just on the side. I think we'll probably won't see a collapse. I think we're already turning it around. Western civilization has quite a capacity to absorb body blows, if you like to put it that way. If you think about something like World War One or World War Two, it's slowly get moving, but once it gets moving, I think it can really respond. Uh, I do. Yeah, I think that we're finally seeing a proper response, and in the next few years, I think that will become very clear. Now, so what I will say is my final comment, and this has been a point I've made before. If we're not seeing a clear response within the next 10 years, then I think we're fucked. Yep. Uh, I guess that's it. I hope not. I think on balance, probably not, but I think it's close.
Right.
Yep.
I
Please,
admit,
I'm interested in what you think.
well, a lot to unpack here. I admit I am troubled with the question itself because every time, and this is not like a shot at our friends over there in Britain or anything like that. I'm just
Mm.
speaking in general. I'm troubled by the question because they're not the only ones that ask this sort of question, but I think the way the question is formatted. We talk about, society a ton. We rarely speak about the individual in society.
Mm.
And every time we talk about society, it's usually in context of how the individual can be expanded to it and not and see I won't even say other way around because I'm not saying society should be at the expense of the individual because that's kind of strange, but see, I can't help but hesitate each time I kind of come up with a bit of the next point to kind of go to this thing because it's really, I say that uh, this is a troubling question, but at the same time, I think it's important to address it carefully. It's important to be a bit delicate about it. All right. Is so, I'm the irony is not lost on me there. I think there's a profundity in a question: is our society fucked? It's in such a question. But uh, so I almost respond with a question: what does it mean for society to be fucked?
So that's fair enough too. I guess it is important for us to establish that we mean the same thing, or that that's generally understood. I think that there's broadly an understanding of what is meant. Essentially, if I may, I would suggest that it means that there'll be something things will occur in wealthy Western countries that haven't been seen for 100 years. Things like famine, things like infrastructure breaking down, all those sorts of problems. Violence on the streets, things that have either been non-existent or extremely rare in
Okay.
any Western country. They would become commonplace for a period of time, hopefully not too long. Right.
Right. And also, there's a bit of an ambiguity as to what society means in this case too. Like, which society? Like, is it just our society in this country? Is it other countries? Is it Western civilization? Is it global? So, so there's too much of an ambiguity for it to mean society because we've got the internet now, among other things, and we're connected. Uh, Things are not as distant as they used to be. So regardless of uh, the establishment of our of nation states and such, we're more in touch with one another more so than we used to be. So, which it how are we saying each society is fucked, or are we saying uh, this society moreover, like the meta society? I think
Mhm.
is in trouble.
I interpret the question to mean Western civilization in particular, which of course would mean essentially the European Union plus the Anglosphere countries.
Mhm.
I tend to subscribe to the idea that there are three pillars of Western civilization: Europe, essentially the United States, and what is now being called the Cancer countries, where the other wealthy English-speaking countries. And I think that that's probably what they're talking about because although you're absolutely right, we are connected. And I think that's really, it's fantastic in so many ways. And so I was thinking about this recently about how much more understanding there is of other cultures now than there was even when I was a kid before the internet, right? Uh, but having said that, think about, say, Islamic society. Islamic society, there's been some rise of feminism there, but you certainly don't see anything woke going on. And they're economically connected to us, but they're not politically and socially connected to us so much. So if Western civilization really tanked badly, and we're seeing infrastructure failing and law and order breaking down and so forth, I suspect, for example, the Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, for example, could get on with what they were doing. There would be some problems, but I think that it wouldn't overflow into their society to a large degree. They might even benefit from it indirectly. So,
What about Asia?
sorry, what was
Because
that? What about it?
what about Asia? Because we keep on talking about Western society and the other extreme being places like Islamic countries.
Mm,
But Asia seems to me that it is sufficiently civilized in our common understanding of it. It's technologically advanced,
mm,
especially in places like Japan and Korea, of course.
mm,
And so we seem to leave that out. And like every time we talk about the East, we talk about as if it were this kind of impoverished sort of world that's in which the morals that only Western society can hold do not apply, or something
mm.
like that. Which I think is, I never cared for the whole distinction between East and West. That's obsolescent, I think. Um, and it's kind of silly to see people really harping on this kind of thing. Like it's not relevant.
I certainly think it won't be relevant in the future. I'm not sure it's irrelevant yet, although I do agree that eventually I think it will be irrelevant, especially with continued mixing of populations and so forth. In fact, interestingly enough, one of the things they're doing at the moment, this is really off to the side, but geneticists have been going around and testing populations and getting DNA tests of the entire, of men and women in these communities, and testing mitochondria and so forth. And the reason they're doing it now is because it is essentially a map of human migration. And if you wait 100 or 200 years, there'll be so much mixing, you won't be able to tell anymore. So we're in this very tiny window between after the technology got invented, before people have essentially mixed communities so much that we can't tell anymore. So that's why they're tracking it right now. And we're probably another 100 to 200 years. So I do tend to think, those sort of concepts will probably disappear. I mean, Australia is actually a really interesting case. Australia, as you probably know, had the White Australia policy until the 1970s. Or maybe you don't. I don't know. Have you heard of that, Bernard?
I might have heard of it. Did
Yeah.
you mention it before once?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's actually really interesting, actually, how they did it. They didn't just come out and say, "Oh, we don't want anybody who isn't white." No, even in the early 20th century, they realized that was an inappropriate thing to say. So they had these tests they could apply to people. And so they would test, but they always made sure that when people were coming into Australia, they would always make sure that the results would turn out the way they wanted. And one of them was they could require somebody to make the Lord's Prayer, say the Lord's Prayer in any European language. And if you listen to that, it makes it sound fairly fair. Oh, if you know obviously this is a language that you speak, and so you can do the Lord's Prayer in that language. But nothing in the legislation said the person had to be able to speak it. So they would, if they wanted to keep someone out, they would just ask a person to speak and say the Lord's Prayer in a language they didn't know, and then they could just exclude them, right? So this was used against people from Asia, but it was also used against undesirable people from Europe, right? In fact, there was notoriously a very well-educated European who came to Australia, and it took them 12 goes to find a language he didn't know. They just kept asking him to say the Lord's Prayer in European languages until they eventually found one. They found like some Welsh dialect he didn't know or something, and they
right. I'm pretty sure this. Yeah, I remember some talk about this.
Yeah. So anyway, that's been gone since the early 1970s. A lot of people don't know too. Speaking of the White Australia policy, a lot of people think it extended right back into the colonial era. It actually didn't. It wasn't established until Australia became a country in 1901. Because there was no systematic way. There were 6 colonies on the continent of Australia, and there was no. They were disagreeing with each other constantly. and there was no systematic way of enforcing any sort of immigration before Australia became a single country. It was only from 1901, when Australia became a country, through to the early 1970s. That was the period when the White Australia policy was enforced. But since then, even starting in the 1980s, we've had a huge amount of immigration, particularly from Hong Kong. Wealthy people from Hong Kong, principally, obviously, were getting out before Hong Kong was returned to China. Australia, perhaps surprisingly, as a participant in the Vietnam War, Australia took in quite a large number of Vietnamese refugees in the 1970s, South Vietnamese refugees, so I guess they were considered to be allies in the war. So they came to Australia in the 1970s, and people from Hong Kong in the 1980s and onwards in the 1990s. Since then, there's been a huge amount of immigration from Asia, which Australia is just on the doorstep. And if Australia isn't an Asian country already, it's going to be an Asian country within 50 to 100 years. So talking about what you're talking about there, and my wife and I enjoy food from lots of different countries, and it's when my wife first came to Australia in the early parts of the 21st century, early years of the 21st century, it was quite hard to find what you could describe as sort of exotic Asian food, maybe more traditional Asian food.
Right.
And I knew a few places you could get it. Now it's everywhere. It really is. You can go to pretty much most suburbs and find something that's actually quite traditional. So that's in only a space of 20 years or so.
Right.
So I guess going along those lines, there's huge transition happening in Australia at the moment.
This sounds like that's the sort of thing that TradCons will be incredibly upset about.
Mm-hmm. So my view, and this is a view I've had since I was at least in school, and I was somewhat influenced by one of my teachers, my chemistry teacher actually, who himself happened to have an Asian wife, and he's Anglo, and he would talked about this a couple of times, and I realized he was on the right track. Essentially, I think what's going to end up is Australia's basically going to be it'll be a very mixed country. It'll continue to be an English-speaking country. It'll continue to have common law, but otherwise, it'll be a very mixed country. So you could almost see it in 100 years of being an English-speaking Asian country.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be at all surprised.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, and we have the same problems here that are in most other Western countries. We have the rise of woke and so forth. It has been a very tolerant country, certainly while I've been around in the last few decades. But I do worry about all Western countries with the growing rise of intolerance. It tends to manifest differently in every country, I think, but it's there in every country.
That makes sense.
So I guess getting back to the original question, is Western civilization fucked? You sort of talked about Western civilization there. I don't know what your is civilization. I think the question was, is civilization fucked, actually? So I know, would you go with a definitive answer after sort of exploring that a little bit?
So it's almost impossible to have a definitive answer to it, because the question itself is not definitive. Because another thing that's ambiguous is the solution, how to make it not fucked. Because everybody's got a different kind of idea about how society is fucked, and they might be different, completely diametrically opposed. And likewise, the solution to that will be opposed. Of course, like one thing I'm noticing a lot in the men's rights sphere today is that the solution is more religion or something, or and sometimes sometimes it's really overarching and it's apocalyptic. I'm not saying that the religion is the solution to the apocalyptic part. I'm saying that the fear is apocalyptic. And at the same time, they would like to see that happen, don't they? It's they just want to see the world burn and such. It's almost like they're counting on it.
I've certainly known people who have implied that they want to see the world burn, and my response is always the same as I alluded to earlier. The bit beforehand with the world it's burning is really painful for everybody, even if you were right. Okay, even if you warned everybody, even if you were right about what was going to happen, it would be an absolutely horrible time, and a fairly high proportion of people wouldn't even survive it, even if they were right. So I would much rather avoid the fall of civilization and see a gradual transition away from the problems we're seeing, a painless transition. Having said that, there are plenty of societies that ended up with only a dramatic change, fixing things. I mean, I guess France is a classic example where they had an autocratic monarchy, very, very powerful. The people were impoverished. There certainly were people who saw the problems, and it ended up in revolution, and then revolution again, and revolution again.
Right.
For probably about 100 years. I don't think a lot of people don't realize that about French history. It wasn't the French Revolution and then everything was okay. They restored them. They had an emperor. They invaded Russia. They restored the monarchy. They got rid of the monarchy again. On and on it went. Yep.
Right. Yep. Yep. I'm sorry. I'm still troubled by the question, because it doesn't seem to leave room for the individual making its own way. Like, it doesn't talk about carrying on, you know. It doesn't talk about anything other than a bunch of sheep, I think. Basically, the idea being that, everything is affected as a society and not in any way more granularly. Like, yeah, even like individual families, they're not even talking about it. It's like, everything has to be completely reset or saved at the same time. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, when you talk about families, you mean opinions differing within families? You mean that
No, I mean, like I said, individuals carrying on their way and families carrying on their own way instead of society collapsing as a whole. Like, we don't appreciate the fact that these units could resist or fall because of their own merits. Like, we always have to speak in terms of these collectives, and I'm getting really sick.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, we are dependent upon the nation in which we live to provide certain services. And if the nation stopped being able to provide those services, especially if it did so suddenly, that would be a serious problem which would affect everybody. So there are things that can happen that will affect everybody at once. I think you're saying that maybe more granular and where people are thinking about it too much at a societal level. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a big part of it. I mean, you kind of brought up that, so this is making me think of one thing. The more dependent we are on that state, that society to have certain services, the more therein lies the problem. We're too dependent on that kind of thing instead of being more self-sufficient. Yeah, right.
So you're saying essentially move back more towards self-sufficiency because it would make the entire society more robust, I suppose.
Exactly, and that's what America was supposed to be. It's not even ironic that I'm talking about America right now, just because I'm here in America and you're not. Everybody talks about America. The Brits talk about America. You certainly talk about America. It's like, if anyone thinks of robustness, they think of America, whether it's currently being practiced or not, whether it's currently false or not. But that's what America should have been this whole time. And yet Americans are still talking about their society as if it was some European collective or something, And this is almost disillusioning levels of annoying to me.
Well, the founding fathers of the US didn't even want a central bank, as I recall. The country certainly moved a long way from what probably the view of the founding fathers.
Exactly. Yep. Right.
I mean, I've never lived in the US. I did, as you know, I lived in Canada. I visited. I did about an hour's drive from the border, so I visited quite a lot. And I've also had visited before, so and since actually. So I've probably had a good bit of a feel from the country from an outsider's perspective. My view of it is that it's a very varied place, and I think one of the interesting and one of the nice things about the US actually, and this is something that both can certainly Australia absolutely lacks, and Canada does to a certain extent. If you want to live in the US, or you've got a US citizenship or whatever, and you can live in the US, you can pretty much look around and say, what sort of society would I like to live in almost, and pick a state that sort of moderately closely matches what you want. I don't know if it's as true as it was, but the fact that there's a great deal of autonomy between the states, I think, is actually quite a strength of the country, and gives them it's nice for the individual to have that opportunity to be able to decide where to live and what system to live under to a certain extent.
Mhm.
I don't know how you feel about that as an American.
Seems like an accurate enough description to me.
Yeah. So in comparison, Australia is relatively homogenous. And the flip side of that is Australians move around a lot. Most people have lived in 2 or 3 states. I think there has been some calculation of the average, and I think it was above 2. I've lived in 3. I've lived in 3. There you go. So as well as overseas. Canada's a little bit more autonomous, especially with Quebec, but less so with the other provinces. But nevertheless, there is more variation among the provinces. And for example, at one point, I was tempted to look at living in Alberta, just because I thought the way that the environment there was probably quite nice in terms of the economic environment. We lived in Ontario, but yeah, absolutely, still nothing on the US, where you've got there's essentially 50 different options, and one of them is an island state in the middle of the Pacific, so that's nice too.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot. I think the economic strength of the US. I mean, all Western countries to a certain extent. I was quite impressed by the ability of the various economies to absorb the shutdown of the pandemic. I thought it would be worse. Australia really went for a hard shutdown to a large degree. At least, so Australia closed all the state borders, and then left it up, and each individual state then could choose what to do. Some states went for really hard lockdowns. We did here in Queensland initially, and essentially kept it out of the state, and then was able to a large degree, and was able to then open up earlier than some of the others. But yeah, so essentially, actually, oh dear, I lost my train of thought there on the pandemic. But yeah, I guess getting back to what I was saying, you've got that. It's a more homogenous country, and so yeah, less choice as to where you can live in terms of the variety and where you can live. So I think oh yes, that's what I was talking about. Sorry, strength of the economy. I was quite impressed by the strength of the Australian economy to absorb that, and I think that's true for every country. The US has got an enormous amount of wealth. I mean, it's the only country so far which has landed humans on the moon, for example. That was an enormous economic endeavor, and it was simply beyond pretty much every other country, including at the time the Soviet Union.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess going on from that, if there was a societal collapse, these countries can absorb a lot. Having said that, they've spent some of that capital. They had some of the reserves recently. And if the problem continued on for long enough, whatever problem it happened to be, if there was just a general social breakdown or something along those lines, we could see terrible disasters occurring in famine and high mortality rates and things that, as I said, probably haven't seen in the West in 200 years, actually. So it'd be interesting to see. Oh, getting back to Asia too, this is a really good point you brought up. I mentioned the Middle East, which of course is most of it's technically in Asia, but it's considered to be a separate, exactly. It includes parts of North Africa, so it's a bit fuzzy. Iran, I count as being in the Middle East, but Afghanistan and Pakistan, I don't count as being in the Middle East, for example. On the other side, Libya, I think I would count as part of the Middle East, but probably Tunisia, but beyond that, and Morocco, no, I don't think so. So,
yeah,
it's arbitrary, I know. So, Asia's a real interesting case. It was very common a few years ago to refer to the 21st century as the Asian century. I don't think it was I think it was mostly the media doing that, and I was never a fan of the term. Because
sorry,
it's still
was that the 80s, was it? Sorry.
No, no, the Asian century. It was very common, particularly here, to refer to the 21st century as the Asian century.
Oh,
It
okay,
started
okay,
in the
sure, yeah.
it started in the probably the early years of the century. Some people had said it in the late years of the last century. I was never much of a fan of this because there's still a lot of poor areas in Asia, a lot of poor countries. There are obviously some very wealthy countries as well. If I had to pick, I'd say there's a good chance the 22nd century is going to be the Asian century because I suspect by then countries like the Philippines will have improved significantly. And I think really Asia could start to really throw its weight around in the 22nd century. Probably certainly from 2050 onwards, I think we'll probably start seeing a lot more interest in Asia economically and so forth. The US has redeployed military forces to Australia. There are now US Marines here, I think, all the time. There are US fighters, jets are going to be training here and so forth. Singaporean pilots already train here. And that's partly a result of a perceived necessity to shift to a focus towards Asia for the United States. But getting back to what you're saying, I think that, I think the future of Asia is very bright. There's obviously there's a couple of, I mean, the two most populated countries are right next to each other in Asia, China and India. But I do think overall, I think that the future of Asia is bright. And as I said, I think probably I wouldn't be surprised if the 22nd century is very much an Asian century. And that's where you'd see those countries advancing from 2050 onwards and seeing the wealth, a big middle class grow. And can those countries, whatever crisis strikes the West, if it's a social crisis, I don't think it would affect Asia, and they might even benefit from it because the West will have been removed as a competitor. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Japan's an interesting case, and South Korea because of their low birth rate. And the fact that they don't bring in large immigrant populations the way that Western countries do. And in fact, Australia and Canada, post-pandemic, and I think New Zealand also, are all bringing in record numbers of immigrants to kind of make up for the fact that they stopped bringing in immigrants for a couple of years. I think if they can get over the population problem, I think my view is those are the main problems facing. That's the main problem facing Japan and South Korea. And if they can get over that, I think the future is probably pretty bright there too. I think Japan's betting on automation. That's what I've read. I know,
Yeah.
having lived there, I'm always interested in your thoughts on that. South Korea, the birth rate is now below one birth per woman, which is,
Mm.
I think, just a rate that I think we would never have predicted. I certainly would never have predicted a few decades ago.
Sure, yeah. The Korea one's a bit of a surprise to me too.
Yeah, it is, and
But
it's dropped quickly, I think, too.
exactly. But if I were to recontextualize that original question, is society fucked? Is civilization fucked? If the question were contextualized to Japan, I might say more on the affirmative. It might be because it's not just the birth rate. It's the complacent attitude of the Japanese. It's really defeatist for the most part. Like, look at how they just completely fell into in line when it comes to the masking and the vaccinating, and they didn't need to mandate it once.
Right. Okay. Okay. So they
Right.
didn't pass laws to do it, or they didn't have to
They
enforce
didn't
the
need
law.
to. No,
Right.
it was all done by societal shame.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there might have been laws here or there, but but for the most part, I remembering an interview I did with an American who lived there. I think he's a citizen there. I'm not sure, but it's I might be remembering that wrong. But there's a guy called Voltaire in Japan, which I don't know if he's active anymore. But he told me that they didn't need mandates for this kind of stuff. It was all done in terms of societal attitudes.
Yeah.
If you don't mask, then you're scrutinized, basically,
Yeah.
society itself. So you know therein lies the folly of saying is society fucked, because like how relevant is the question if society itself is doing that to itself? You know, we talk about it as if it's, something external. It's like some one, one idea or one thing that crashes it. But really, it's up to the integrity of the people in society itself, because there is no society except all the people in it. So we need to be accountable for this kind of stuff. See, this is the problem I have with the world society. I'm kind of going off track here, I know. But to say that society is this or society is that is deferring accountability to me. We're deferring accountability away from the individual. So, you know, it's on you, it's on everyone,
Yeah,
because we are what we call society. It's not this monolith. It
yeah.
doesn't have to be, you know. And I say,
And I was
okay,
going to
I
say,
got, yeah, sure. And so maybe I do have a definitive answer to this one, but it's not the one they're expecting. It's not a yes or no. It doesn't have to be, because you've got the power to
to
be
fix.
that part of society to not get fucked over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that comes back to what I was saying, where I hope that that people are going to stand up so this doesn't happen. But I'm not 100% sure that will occur or that it will occur fast enough. But on balance, I guess it's probably a fairly similar position to mine, I guess, then, in that I think it does come down to whether people are going to step up or not. I'm just not sure they're going to. I think they probably will, but I'm not 100% sure. I'm 55% sure they're going to,
Mhm. Right.
at
Absolutely.
least here, and here in
Yeah.
similar countries. Um, I pondered this idea over the years. As you say, society is not a monolith at all. Culture is really interesting, actually, because there are things that go universally through a country or even nearby countries where uh, most people will generally recognize how something works. I mean, for example, gasoline or petrol, as we'll call it here in Australia. I was just thinking about this today.
Mhm.
In Australia, you can pay it at what we call the bowser. That's the place you put. I know that's an Australian term, actually. I think British also. It's the thing you use to put the fuel in. But most people don't. You actually go in. It's kind of cultural. It's just expected that you'll go in and pay in the gas station, or as we call it, the servo.
Right.
I was just thinking about that today, and that's sort of something that if you live in a country, when you move to a country, and having moved to Canada, even a relatively similar country, there were all sorts of things like that caught me out all the time, for years even. That just the way things work was
Mhm.
just a little bit different, just different enough that it tripped me up, right?
Mhm.
So culture, there is a culture in a country or in a society, right? But culture also goes down to family level. So everyone who lives in their own, and psychologists have talked about this, everyone who lives in a particular house has the culture of that house. There's things that work in the things that happen in that house, they're expected to happen in a particular way.
Right.
So everybody has their shower in the night time, or perhaps everybody has their shower in the morning, or whatever. Or the first person up turns the coffee, makes the coffee, or something like that. But on top of that, you have a broader culture which affects the way you do things in your country. And it's almost until you move, you don't really notice a lot of it. Um, so it's there, but it's at the same time quite nebulous. I find it quite fascinating, actually, and I think it's part of what makes us human. As far as we know, we haven't seen this, except maybe some of our close relatives. We haven't really seen this, I don't think, in other species, at least not to the same extent, where there's a set of sort of rules and moral and social mores and so forth, and things that are acceptable and things that aren't acceptable, and we learn them, and that makes up the culture, and that helps keep the society cohesive. And in the case of Japan, it sounds like it was follow the rules, or
Yeah.
without anybody to enforce them.
Exactly. Because going back to Japan, they've got a lot of good. I'll be the first to tell you they've got a lot of good. The automation stuff is good, and I'm gonna go into automation rant after this. Remind me, but because I don't want to go off track again. But the problem is, it is ironically the argument from tradition that they are going to fall apart, because they're, you know there's a lot of inflexibility in their day-to-day life, because that's the way it should be. That's traditionalism. That's the way it should be, and that's the way we've always doing it. Is practically the definition of traditionalism. Um, and watch this society fall apart because of it. You know,
Mm.
um, because they can't stand up for themselves because of various motivations. They fear change. They fear defending themselves physically in any Western sense. Not I'm using the word Western as if it mattered, and I said it didn't. But because yeah, it's an entire culture of people who not only can't stand up for themselves, they think it's right that they shouldn't.
Yes, okay. That's probably the second one is probably the more dangerous part, actually. Yeah,
Yeah,
rather than they can't. Yes, yes. By the way, I have a definition for Western civilization that I use. So if you ever hear me use it, I do have a specific definition, which I'm happy to give you. So, okay. So when I say Western civilization, and I thought about this for a while to sort of come up with it, and I'm not the first person obviously to come up with a definition, but this is the definition I use, and I think it's a fairly standard one. A Western country is a country in Western Europe or a country where the majority of the population descend from people who came from Western Europe, but it excludes Latin America because I think Latin America has become a separate civilization, a daughter civilization of Western civilization.
interesting.
So that's the definition I use. So New Zealand, Australia, Canada, or United States are all Western countries. As now, where does Western Europe start? Well, probably through the axis through Germany and Italy. So Germany's a Western country and Italy are Western countries, but only just. But after you move to the east, no, Poland I would not say is a Western country. Yeah, there's problems with every definition, but I think there are broad trends through Western civilization that we've seen.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
that's the definition. So getting back to Japan then, I found that really interesting actually. Yeah. So you're of course, as we've said before, an avowed libertarian. Would you say that libertarianism is not is hasn't really caught on in Japan then? Would that be a fair statement?
Not in philosophy. Like
Okay.
so here's the thing. I'm harkening back to my talk with Voluntary Japan once more. There are some things that are sufficiently libertarian, and I don't necessarily realize it. They're not really conscious of it. Like, for
Right.
instance, like there's not too much in the form of like obstructions to like opening certain kinds of industries. I don't mean industries like a certain shop or something like that. Or there's not the equivalent of a FDA food regulation quite as much there.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
like some standards. I think I'm remembering that correctly. But some things are more straight. Some associations are more straightforward with each other, and that is probably the extent of to which Japan is libertarian. But of course, it's not libertarian in the fact that you probably can't own firearms the same way that in theory you can in the United States. Now, of course, it keeps starting the United States and they're trying to push all these gun laws and whatnot. So it will depend on the territory. But I'd like to think it's an American idea.
So in that case, I would say probably from what you're saying that you could say they're economically libertarian, but not socially.
Even that's a bit of a stretch. It's like there's some association that's more libertarian, like with one another.
Right.
But I don't think. I mean, obviously, taxes are pretty bad over there. I mean, it's bad
Okay.
everywhere, but it's like it's still, it's not a free market paradise or anything like that.
Right.
It's
Okay.
right.
Fair enough. That's
And
interesting. Actually, I don't know anything about the tax rate in Japan or South Korea for that matter. So
yes,
you're saying that's not pretty fairly high tax rate.
right.
What's medicine like there? Do they have a socialized medical system in?
They have a nationalized healthcare system over there now. The reason it doesn't seem as bad is because the country is so small. basically. So it really seems like it's kind of working out. But there are some weird aspects to the healthcare system over there because so as my understanding, you do get a health card, and like you can't get certain kinds of medicines. Like here, I have some antacids and stuff like that. I can just go to the store and get some antacids. But for just about anything, you kind of need a prescription for.
Oh, really?
Right. And also there are some interesting cases that I've been kind of doing some studies as like comparisons with different nationalized healthcare systems, and like whereas it comes across like as this is free health system or something like that, everything seems like it doesn't cost much, but this is not really true anyway. But what doctors like to do is needlessly extend their patients' bed rest in hospitals. They like to kind of book like an excessive amount of time, confined to the hospital bed, just to
Yep.
make up the amount that they would otherwise.
Right.
If that
Okay.
makes sense, right? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So there's like a lot of weirdnesses, and also, you want to go to the doctor on a weekend? Forget it. You've got to allocate some time in like a normal work day.
Is that right?
That's my
Okay.
understanding of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
It's I find that really interesting. Yeah, because I've lived in, as I said, Australia and Canada, and Canada has a strict socialized medical system. Apart from a few clinics that were grandfathered in because they already existed in the 1970s, there's no way, at least when I left, and as far as I know still, there's no way to essentially pay for medical care in Canada. You have to go through the system. No? In comparison, Australia has what could be described as a hybrid system. I'm increasingly calling it a hybrid system. So we have a socialized medical system, which is actually quite efficient. It's one of the most efficient ones in the world. But at the same time, there's actually nothing stopping you engaging a doctor privately for healthcare, for example. Or, if you want to have an operation and the doctor, there's some diagnosed condition and you want to have an operation, you can go through the free health system and wait a period of time, or you can drop money on the table and have it whenever you and the doctor and the hospital can make an arrangement. So, I've actually stopped saying our system is do we have a socialized medical system, because our system is actually, I think, really hybrid.
I see.
Mm.
Well, one big illusion I think people have is that the socialized system is free, because if you're taxed and
Yeah.
if you get all the income and it's going right into that system, it's it's the opposite of free. So, but the problem is it's very makes kind of them complacent because they're not paying it themselves. They think it's free, but
Mm.
I don't think that's true.
Well, I mean, that's right. It's, I mean, casual conversation, people do refer to it as a free health cover. I suspect here, at least, most people are aware of the cost because it's actually itemized separately in our tax, which may be a really good thing. So you actually see it in your tax. It's separate to the rest of the tax system. So you know exactly how much money you've paid into the system because it's on your tax return, which probably
Yeah.
helps. Yeah, I
So,
think
so you
in
guys admit that that you're being stolen from.
Exactly, that's right. It's actually it's a two-tier system. So where everybody pays a certain amount if you're paying any tax at all, and if you're a high income earner and you didn't get private health cover, they hit you with a second amount. So yeah,
Right. Yeah.
it's probably a bit more honest that way, I guess. So,
Mhm.
as I said, I think it works for us, and I've said that before. I think it works for Australia. Our system is fairly efficient compared to other health systems around the world. We pay a fraction. I've previously compared it to Germany, where that you get more in Germany than you get in Australia, but we pay about 20% as much. So you sort of get, maybe 20% more than we get, but we pay 20% as much. So it's whether they've some things that they've made they get people to pay for, and they've taken the edge off the system, I think, in that regard. So, whereas in the UK, I don't know if it's still the case. At one point, they were refunding people for taxi trips to the hospital. Everything was free. And I think I was quite shocked when I saw that. It was actually a documentary by Michael Moore where he showed this happening. Somebody actually went to the hospital and then and then they got refunded for them. I thought that was quite extraordinary. Yeah. And that blew out their costs. The British costs, as we know, with the NHS are really blowing out. So, yeah. So I guess probably covered that topic quite well. I think actually, if
I think
society
so. Yeah.
is fucked. Any final comments before we?
Before we move on, let me just say this. You are the society. Are you gonna fuck yourself?
Yep.
No.
I
So
failed. I guess there are states that have failed, so we know it's at least possible. And
right,
historically, there are states that did fail and recovered. France
yeah,
again with the
right.
revolution, which was pretty brutal for a while,
Mhm.
and I think it was certainly a failed state for a while, but they did recover. And there are currently states that are failed, so we know it's possible. But yeah, I guess that's the question, isn't it? Are
I
we
guess,
going to let?
yeah. Sure, right, yeah. So remember this, in cases such as these, let's take a page from Paul Elam. There are no victims, only volunteers. If we
Mm,
fucked our society, we volunteered for it.
mm.
So let's not, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
So
Prefer not to if we can manage. As I said, I said before, I've known some people who sort of looked at it with a bit of glee, and I've known some other people who were half hoping for it, even though they realize it's going to be horrible. It will be absolutely awful, and there's a good chance that you won't even make it through. So let's not.
right. Mhm. Right. Sure.
Absolutely.
Okay, yep. All right.
I do have a couple of other things, but I think we've been going, I think, about an hour. So I think I'd like to move into the next one. It's nothing significant, nothing time critical, but I think we probably should move it to the next one.
Okay, sure, yeah. Can I talk about automation, or are we kind of going to the limit right now? Because I said I wanted to talk about automation.
Why
I'm sorry?
don't we leave it till next time?
All right. Let's talk about
All right.
automation because it does have to do with men's issues.
Absolutely. I think
Yes,
it'll be
yeah,
a
yeah.
big topic to talk about next time, and I've got a couple of other small ones to bring up as well. Brilliant.
Mhm. Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Mhm. Awesome. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.